Let the games begin.
Shake it, baby!
Another pawn joins us.
Yes, sir. Of course. Very well. Of course. Of course. Very well, very well, very well. Agreed. Of course. At once. Course. Agreed. At once. Agreed. Very well. Agreed. Of course. At once. Of course. At once. Very well. At once. Course. Very well. At once. Agreed. Very well. Of course. Agreed. At once. Very well. Of course. Of course. At once. Of course. Agreed. Of course. Agreed. Of course. Agreed. Very well. At once. Agreed. At once. Very well. At once. Very well. At once. Course. Very well. At once. Agreed. Of course. Agreed. Course. Agreed. At once. Agreed. Very well. At once. Very well. At once. Very well. Course. At once. Of course. Agreed. At once. Agreed. Of course. Once. Of course. Very well. At once. Very well. At once. Course. Very well. Of course. Very well. Agreed. Of course. Once. At once. Agreed. Very well. At once. At once. Very well. Very well. Agreed. At once. Very well. At once. Very well. Agreed. Very well. Agreed. Course. Very well. At once. Agreed. At once. Agreed. Very well. At once. Of course. At once. Agreed. At once. Of course. At once. Very well. Very well. Of course. Agreed. Yes, sir. At once. Agreed. At once. Of course. Very well. Of course. Agreed.
First objective met. Reinforcements approaching. Unit ready. Structure captured. Unit ready.
Ready. Yes, sir. Reporting.
Unit ready.
Reporting. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Waiting orders.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Reporting. Waiting orders. Very close. Very close. Ready. Waiting orders.
Unit lost.
As you wish.
Unit ready.
Vehicle reporting. Waiting orders. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Unit reporting.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. No.
Unit ready.
Yes, sir. No.
Unit ready.
Waiting orders.
Unit ready.
Vehicle reporting.
Unit lost.
Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Vehicle reporting.
Unit ready. Repair. Unit prepared. Training.
Waiting orders. Yes, sir.
Unit ready.
Waiting orders. Vehicle affirmative.
Unit ready.
Waiting orders. Yes, sir.
Prepared. Unit ready.
Waiting orders.
Insufficient funds.
Waiting orders. Reporting. Unit affirmative. Waiting orders. Affirmative.
Insufficient funds.
Vehicle acknowledged.
Units. Insufficient
Yes, sir.
funds. Unit ready.
Ready and waiting. At once.
Preparing. Insufficient
Ready and waiting.
funds. Repairing.
Unit reporting.
Insufficient
Yes, sir.
funds.
Affirmative.
Unit lost. Repairing. Insufficient funds.
Affirmative.
Unit
No.
ready.
No. Ready and waiting. Affirmative.
Unit lost. On hold.
Ready and waiting. Affirmative. Affirmative. Unit reporting.
Unit lost.
Yes, sir. The
Unit
affirmative.
lost.
Acknowledged. Yes,
Unit lost.
agreed.
Unit lost.
Waiting order. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Unit lost.
Acknowledged. Reporting. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
On hold.
Yes, sir. Reporting. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Reporting. Unit. Yes, sir. Reporting. Reporting. Very well. Ready and waiting. Very well. Waiting order. Yes, sir.
Minutes.
Ready and waiting. Wait. At once. At once. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Unit lost.
Waiting order. Waiting order.
Warning. 4 minutes remaining.
Waiting order. At once. At once.
Training. Unit
Report
ready.
vehicle. Reporting.
Warning. 3 minutes remaining. Unit ready.
Awaiting. Ready and waiting. Vehicle. Reporting. Reporting. Very well.
Unit
Very
ready.
well. Yes, sir. At
Lost.
once. Acknowledged. Of course. Ready and
Warning. 6
of
minutes
course.
remaining. Unit lost.
At once. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Reporting.
Unit
Agreed.
lost.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Acknowledged. Reporting. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Unit lost. Unit lost.
Affirmative. Reporting. Awaiting order. Of course. Vehicle reporting. Affirmative.
Reinforcements have arrived.
Yes, sir.
Unit lost.
Reporting. Acknowledged.
Mission